Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping back into the shadowy corners of Victorian London where insomnia wasn't just a nuisance, it was practically a social epidemic. Cobblestone streets echo under your shoes, and everything smells faintly of coal smoke, overcooked beef, and something herbal drifting from a second-story window. It's quiet, but not peacefully so. More like the city is holding its breath. A lamplighter tips his hat somewhere. A baby cries into the fog, and someone in a cramped kitchen above a dress shop is heating up a pot of lettuce soup, not for dinner, but for sleep. Yes, lettuce. You can almost taste the soft bitterness rising with the steam. It's a humble dish. Water, chopped leaves, maybe a few grains of barley if you're feeling fancy. This isn't Cuisinart's desperation in a bowl, and yet for some reason, this broth of limp greens became one of the most whispered about sleep aids in 19th century households. You stir the pot slowly, the way you imagine a Victorian mother would, hoping tonight it works better than last night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, if you're listening from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where these stories reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin walking again, past narrow alleyways and crooked signs, deeper into the rhythm of a sleepless century. You pass a greengrocer's stall, its shelves nearly bare. But one crate is still full. Butterhead lettuce, soft and sweet, faintly dewy despite the soot. Back then, they believed certain lettuces had more power than others. Romaine was decent. Iceberg, not yet a thing. But the variety called Lactuca virosa, or wild lettuce, was the real prize. Bitter, milky, and slightly narcotic, in effect. It was nicknamed opium lettuce not because it was quite that powerful, but because it pretended to be. No surprise then that lettuce soup became a kind of domestic sedative, simmered quietly behind lace curtains. It promised sleep without scandal. Unlike the stronger stuff, laudanum, ether, or morphine-laced tonics, hawked by traveling apothecaries who also sold miracle cures for gout and baldness. And this wasn't some fringe folk belief. Mainstream medical journals of the era, like The Lancet, contained earnest discussions of lettuce extract, praising its gently soporific qualities. Doctors were genuinely intrigued. Was it the mild sedative properties? Or was it just that a warm, bland broth helped lull a person into comfort? Historians still argue whether the lettuce itself had a physiological impact, or if it simply gave people something to believe in. In truth, the Victorian mind didn't separate food and medicine like we do. Meals were treatments, spices had moral implications, and the idea of something as humble as soup doubling as therapy made perfect sense, especially when most households couldn't afford a physician but could afford a cabbage. You picture a woman in a dim kitchen, now white cap askew, sleeves rolled up, stirring slowly as she hums. Her husband coughing in the next room. A child with red eyes and a restless fidget. She knows this soup might not work, but she also knows it might help, and sometimes that's enough. One spoonful, then another. It doesn't taste good, but it tastes like someone tried. Even the serving of it became ritual. Always warm, never hot. Drunk from a heavy ceramic mug, preferably near a fire. Taken in silence with a blanket pulled tight. It was a sensory choreography that signaled the body. Time to rest. Time to drift. Time to stop rehearsing every mistake of the week. Fringe detail. Some households even paired the soup with soft music played on harmoniums or zithers, genteel instruments designed not to entertain, but to soothe. One London paper even recommended that insomniacs sip lettuce broth while listening to the sound of slowly ticking clocks. Something about the steady rhythm helping the pulse match the silence. Or maybe the Victorians just really loved clocks. you're beginning to suspect they were onto something. Modern sleep science agrees that routine is a powerful cue. Maybe it wasn't the lettuce at all. Maybe it was the same steps each night, the same flavor, the same borrowed piece, like lullabies for grown dash-ups. And yet, the lettuce retained its sleepy reputation, so much so that pharmacists began selling syrup of lettuce in little blue bottles with labels like Dr. Goodnight's Nocturnal Elixir. Spoiler, most of those included alcohol, opiates, or both. But the lettuce gave it plausible deniability. "It's just a vegetable, sir," said the salesman. "Perfectly safe for children." Of course, there were critics. One 1872 medical pamphlet dismissed lettuce soup as more broth than balm, claiming that its fans were simply underfed and sedated by calorie deficiency. Others insisted the only real cure for insomnia was a firm conscience and an uncluttered mind. Spoiler, this advice came from people who were probably sleeping just fine. Still, the lettuce endured because even in a time of rapid scientific progress, telegraphs, railways, germ theory people still needed small, earthy comforts. A warm bowl, a dim room, a belief that rest could be coaxed, not commanded. So you pause now in the middle of this imaginary street and think about your own rituals, your mugs of tea, your playlists, your stubborn scrolling even when your eyes blur. You wonder what your great-great-grandmother might think of your blue, light glow and noise-canceling headphones. Probably she'd just hand you a bowl and say, "Drink this, it helped me once." The next street you wander down smells faintly of lavender and scorched sugar-rad companions, unless you know the Victorians. This part of town hums with another set of remedies. One's less green and more perfumed. You pass a cart carrying bundles of dried herbs, the air behind it trailing the scent of chamomile, valerian roots, and dried poppy husks. The vendor hums, not unlike the woman with the lettuce soup, because sleep is a lullaby. Everyone keeps trying to write in their own language. Lavender, of course, was the queen of Victorian sleep aids. Not a whispery essential oil in a chic dropper bottle, but big, coarse bundles of dried stalks stuffed into pillows, tied around bed, and sometimes burned in small ceramic bowls to release their calming scent. If you slept in a room that smelled faintly of burning flowers, you were either rich, anxious, or both. This was the era of insomnia sachets, little embroidered pockets filled with calming herbs, slipped under pillows or stitched into nightcaps. The logic. If you could trick your nose, you could trick your brain. Modern aromatherapy wasn't a thing yet, but Victorian ladies had already weaponized their senses for battle against sleeplessness. You spot a window lit dimly with candlelight, a narrow laced curtain drawn back just enough to see inside. A man is reading, slumped in a wooden chair. Beside him, a steaming cup of warm milk with nutmeg, another sleep cure that's been making insomniacs drowsy since before printed clocks. The milk is always served slightly warm, never scalding, and laced with just enough spice to distract from the dull flavor. His eyes blink slowly. The book droops. Somewhere between page 83 and 84, he surrenders to the weight of the milk and the day. Mainstream fact. Nutmeg was often recommended by 19th century physicians in small doses as a sedative, but if you've ever watched a Victorian kitchen operate, small doses were a suggestion, not a rule. In larger quantities, nutmeg can cause hallucinations, nausea, and what one doctor in 1844 politely referred to as unseemly giddiness. So yes, it might knock you out, but not necessarily in a way you'd enjoy. Still, the idea held. Herbal, warm, gently narcotic, that was the Victorian sleep formula. In fact, many believed your body's temperature played a crucial role. Cold rooms were bad for nerves. Hot rooms were worse. The solution: flannel nightwear, thick wool blankets, and a ceramic bed warmer, basically a big stone or metal bottle, filled with hot water, placed between the sheets before bed. If you've never slept in damp wool next to a boiling rock, well, you haven't truly lived the era. Fringe detail. Some, especially anxious Victorians, swore by onion compresses placed at the feet. Yes, onions cut raw, wrapped in cloth, and pressed to the soles as a drawing agent to pull the day's restlessness from the body. Historians still argue whether this practice had any actual physiological effect, or if it simply cleared the room fast enough that everyone got peace and quiet. In another window, a pair of elderly sisters sit quietly under a heavy patchwork quilt. One knits absently, the other counts stitches aloud over and over. Repetition, like soup, was therapy. Counting whether stitches, sheep, or blessings was a form of gentle hypnosis. Even today, some neuroscientists suggest it calms the frontal cortex and signals the brain to enter a slower state. You imagine the quiet click of needles, the soft exhale of a sigh. In this century, anxiety wasn't a diagnosis, it was simply called nervousness, and if you were a woman, it was considered inevitable. Doctors prescribed walks, baths, music, or if you were wealthy enough, rest cures that involved being locked in a room with no stimulation at all. It wasn't sleep they were chasing, it was silence. But even silence needed rituals. So the Victorians lit candles. They steeped herbs. They believed in baths not daily, but purposeful, drawn once a week with rosemary and salt. They believed water could carry tension away, like a current. And they bathed not to be clean, but to be ready for sleep, for dreams, for forgetting you. Pause at a door. The brass knob is warm. Inside, someone is praying softly, rhythmically, just loud enough to hear the rise and fall of vowels. Another sleep aid. This one, spiritual. Evening prayers weren't just about piety. They were cadence words repeated with gentle monotony. Faith doubled as ritual. Say the same words nightly, and the brain begins to exhale on cue. Not everyone prayed, of course. Some preferred the newspapers, others these songs. One infamous London barrister was said to recite legal bylaws backwards until he fell asleep. A fringe habit, maybe, but at least he didn't resort to self-flagellation like the insomniac monks of 14th century Florence. Different story. Very little lettuce involved. You think of how modern life treats sleep as a default, a passive state to be gotten. But Victorians knew better. Sleep was earned, coaxed, wooed. You had to court it like a shy love-a-soft lighting. Warm comforts, pleasant smells, soothing sounds. Some even believed mirrors had to be covered at night, lest the soul get confused and not return properly from its dream wanderings. You wonder, briefly, how many people in 1857 fell asleep under quilts and laces, comforted by the fact that their reflection couldn't watch them drift away. You walk on, there's a cat now, curled on a stoop. Even it looks exhausted. A street singer hums a tune, half forgotten. You don't know the words, but you recognize the rhythm. It sounds like the world rocking gently back and forth. Sleep doesn't come fast in this city, but when it does, it arrives with ceremony. Always. By the time you reach the far edge of the square, the scent of onion feet and nutmeg milk has faded, replaced by something more medicinal. Camphor, maybe, or turpentine. You wrinkle your nose. Not exactly cozy bedtime fare, but the Victorians weren't sentimental about sleep. If you couldn't dream your way there, you could dose it. And in this part of the story, the tinctures come out. You pass by a shadowy storefront with etched glass. Faint candlelight flickering behind jars. A Victorian apothecary. And here, sleep came in bottles. The labels are as poetic as they are unnerving. Soothing syrup, mother's quiet, elixir of stillness. You scan the shelves and your eyebrows rise. Laudanum, chloral, hydrate, bromide powders. Many of these mixtures promised Stan delivered it, but came with the small side effect of dependency or death, but mostly rest. Mainstream fact. Laudanum, a blend of opium and alcohol, was sold freely in 19th century England. Not just to the elite, but over the counter to housewives and day laborers alike. It was the all-purpose balm for headaches, nerves, menstrual cramps, and yes, insomnia. People took it like we take melatonin, only with significantly more euphoria and a dramatically higher chance of hallucinating a Victorian banshee in your bed curtains. A fringe detail. Children's versions existed. One brand called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was aimed at teething infants and listed morphine as an active ingredient. Historians still argue whether the widespread popularity of these syrups reflected desperate parenting or a collective hallucination about what natural meant back then. But either way, it worked. Kids slept. Parents slept. No one asked too many questions. The scene flickers again, and you're inside one of those long, dim drawing rooms with heavy curtains and velvet upholstery that always seemed 2 degrees too dark. A gentleman sits upright in a high-backed chair, cravat slightly loosened. He downs a small spoonful of chloral hydrate, grimaces, then leans his head back. You watch as his breathing slows. It was the era of chemical trust. Sleep came not from peace, but from pharmacy. Doctors prescribed mixtures of chloral hydrate with spirits known informally as knockout drops. Safe if measured, catastrophic if not. And yet, for many, the only option. Even Charles Dickens was said to have carried laudanum in his travel case. He called it his night elixir. Of course, not everyone approved. There were reformers. Temperance societies railed against opiate-laced sleep aids. Health journals warned about the ghosts of addiction, but most people didn't read health journals. They read labels. And those promised dreams. Quiet ones. In one corner of the room, you spot a low table with a small metal burner. A mother stirs a pot with measured focus, releasing a heavy steam laced with vinegar and herbs. Homemade vapor therapy. The goal. Clear the lungs, relax the muscles, and lull the child in the next room to sleep. This wasn't just about sedating the body. It was about preparing the environment. Victorians were obsessed with atmosphere. They adjusted lighting to amber hues, draped cloth over lamps, set bells outside bedroom doors to discourage sudden entry. One writer even suggested that all clocks in the sleeping chambers be muffled because the tick of a second hand was an invitation to insomnia. You chuckle, it's dramatic, but also kind of relatable. Fringe practices abounded. You could soak a rag in camphor oil and tie it around your wrist, or place a sliver of soap beneath your pillow, or sew a dried frog into your mattress lining, though that one was probably more regional folklore than citywide trend. Still, it existed. Memory is nothing if not weird. You wander into a smaller room now, quieter, where a widow rests beneath a canopy bed. The sheets are crisp, the pillow faintly scented with bay leaves. She stares at the ceiling. The laudanum bottle is empty. On her nightstand lies a single folded letter. Not everything Sleep touched was medicinal. Sometimes it was grief. Insomnia, in those days, was called the whispering sickness because it rarely arrived alone. It came with mourning, with guilt, with regret, and while the doctors wrote prescriptions, the poets wrote. You think of Tennyson, of Bronte, of all those ghostly ink-stained pages full of people awake at impossible hours, wondering if they'd ever rest again. Victorians believed emotions lingered in the body like storms in the air. You had to sweat them out, cry them out, or most commonly sedate them. But even the strongest syrup couldn't undo heartbreak. And this, too, they knew. You move on. In a hallway lined with faded portraits, a young servant lights the final candle of the night. She yawns. Her shift is over. She climbed the attic stairs soon, clutching her own tiny vial of bromide mix, a gift from the kitchen maid. She doesn't know what's in it, only that it brings dreams of home. The room smells of starch and lavender. She sighs, blows out the match. Historians still argue whether these chemical sleep cures helped build the modern pharmaceutical industry or delayed true understanding of mental health. But that debate is for another night. Tonight, the story is about survival. Rest was necessary, and in this era, necessary things came in amber bottles with wax-sealed corks. The hallway dims behind you, doors close, fireplaces dwindle. The city, even dosed and drowsy, still breathes, because somewhere, someone is always awake for the next remedy, the next lullaby, the next drop of quiet in a world too loud to sleep in peace. You descend a narrow staircase now, worn wooden steps creaking beneath your bare feet. The wallpaper peels ever so slightly at the corners, like it's trying to whisper its own sleepless story. Down here, you enter a quieter world beneath, the bustle of carriages and clocks. In the cellars of Victorian comfort where silence was cultivated like wine. Tonight's chapter unfolds with a new strategy, routine. Because if potions and powders didn't bring sleep, predictability might. The idea was simple but strict on exact order of operations before bed. You had to brush your hair precisely 100 times. You had to wash your face with lavender water, followed by a brisk towel rub to awaken and then soothe the skin. You had to change into a sleeping gown everyday clothes, never a repeat and whisper a prayer by the bedside. If possible, drink warm milk, or, as some medical texts recommended, beef tea. Yes, that's right. Beef in a cup, because nothing says restful night like sipping soup made from bones and boiled sinew. Mainstream fact. By the mid-1800s, physicians across Britain promoted pre-sleep rituals known as hygienic routines, precursors to what we now call sleep hygiene. These included specific behaviors believed to prepare both body and mind for slumber. But unlike our modern listicles, these weren't optional, they were gospel. Not following the ritual might cause mental excitability, or what one doctor dramatically called nocturnal vexation of the nerves. Fringe detail. Some rituals were seasonal. In the summer, you opened the windows to let the cool humors in. In winter, you'd place a heated brick at your feet, not too hot, lest it stir dreams of fire. One pamphlet recommended reading dull sermons out loud to oneself, since excessive interest is the foe of rest. A tip you now consider applying to your own inbox. You drift into a bedroom now. Pale morning light rests on the bedspread. On the mantel, a clock ticks steadily, no longer muffled, but audible, as if keeping vigil. A man in his middle years is preparing for bed, even though it's only 6 in the evening. He stretches his legs, does a set of calisthenics that look suspiciously like a prelude to sleepwalking, then walks 10 times around his room, clockwise. Always clockwise. He believes in circulation, internal and external. You can almost hear him think blood must flow properly if sleep is to take root. He gargles a mix of salt and chamomile water. Then, finally, he settles in with a copy of Night Thoughts by Edward Young, a famously melancholic poem filled with moonlit death imagery. Sleepy, if not entirely cheerful. This was an era in love with routine. The Victorians didn't just believe in rules, they adored them. Even personal rest had to pass through the filter of societal structure. Wealthier homes kept separate bedrooms for husbands and wives, not just for morality or modesty, but because poor sleep was seen as morally corrosive. Tossing and turning next to a snorer was bad for both body and soul. Historians still argue whether this rigid adherence to bedtime routines helped with actual insomnia or simply gave people something to do while waiting to not sleep. But structure, as you now realize, has its own sleepy charm. Repetition lulls, familiarity soothes, and at least no one was proposing cocaine as a fix for sleeplessness. Yet, in a smaller bedroom maybe, a child's you see a different kind of routine. A nursemaid brushes a girl's curls and hums a soft tune. A bit of milk, a stuffed rabbit with a button eye, and a whispered tale about fairy goblins who steal yawns and return them as dreams. The child giggles, half asleep already. You wonder if the story came from a book, or if the nursemaid made it up on the spot, an improvised spell disguised as narrative. Here, you glimpse the quieter side of Victorian sleep culture, not just the tinctures and treatments, but the tenderness. Not everyone had money for doctors or laudanum, but stories were free. So was rhythm, so was affection when given. You pass by a wash basin, faint steam still curling upward. Nearby, a hand towel lies folded in a perfect square. Someone believed this mattered. Someone believed that folded linen signaled a mind at rest, the discipline of the visible world influencing the invisible one. In the corner, a small fireplace flickers gently. The fire isn't for heat, it's symbolic. Many believed flame carried away worry, burned it up into the rafters where even nightmares couldn't reach. A simple superstition, maybe, but you can't help admiring its warmth. You sit beside it for a moment, just breathe. And now, the moment you didn't expect, a tiny silver bell resting on a tray. Some Victorians rang a bell before bed, not to summon help, but to mark the transition between day and night. A ritual echo of monastery hours, secularized. You like the idea. A sound that declares, now we rest. Nothing more will be done today. Fringe. Detail. There was a brief trend among upper-class households to keep sleep diaries, handwritten logs of how many hours were slept, what dreams were remembered, and what rituals were followed. These weren't always medical. They could be deeply poetic. One man's entry reads, dreamed of my mother's marmalade again. Woke thirsty. Blamed the moon. You smile at that. The room darkens again, and you rise. Down the hall, a clock strikes softly to slow notes. Time moves differently here. Slower, gentler. Every breath in this house feels considered, measured, almost choreographed. Historians still debate whether Victorian routine was driven by true restfulness or by the cultural obsession with control. But tonight, in this imagined house of slow steps and folded towels, you lean toward kindness. Maybe control was the only way they knew how to care, and maybe that care, however rigid, gave shape to something quiet, something sacred. You pause now at the edge of a parlor where heavy curtains drink in the sound, and every object seems wrapped in velvet hush. The evening has advanced, but the rituals haven't ceased. If anything, they've grown more peculiar. This next chapter doesn't concern food or bedtime prayersets about lettuce, lettuce, the humble solid base, the unassuming leaf. In Victorian England, it was considered a legitimate tool in the war on insomnia. You step into a modest kitchen, copper pots gleaming and a kettle softly hissing on the hob. A woman in a linen apron is preparing what a handwritten recipe calls sleep broth for nervous ladies. You lean closer. The ingredients are not what you'd expect: shredded romaine lettuce, a splash of milk, a pinch of nutmeg, and just, for depth, a slice of stale bread. The mixture is simmered gently, not to be seasoned, but to be subdued. Mainstream historical fact. Lettuce contains a compound called lacticarium, a milky substance with mild sedative effects. Victorian herbalists latched onto this and began recommending lettuce-based teas and soups as natural remedies for waking nerves and moon-drawn melancholy, the era's version of chamomile tea but significantly slimmer. Fringe detail. Some households even kept a separate patch of lettuce just for sleep aid, growing it in shaded corners so it would be cooler and dreamier, in effect. There are documented cases of physicians prescribing lettuce rest, where patients would lie in a darkened room with leaves placed over their foreheads and wrists. Lettuce, applied, ingested, worshipped. The soup bubbles, now, filling the air with a vegetal sweetness. It doesn't smell unpleasant, just green. The kind of smell that makes you feel like maybe your bones are turning into moss. The woman ladles it into a porcelain bowl and carries it up a narrow flight of stairs. You follow her to a bedroom where a gentleman, presumably her husband, lies already tucked in, hands folded on his stomach like he's rehearsing for a painting of a very sleepy saint. She sets the bowl beside him and kisses his forehead. He does not drink the soup right away. First, he sniffs it. Then he mutters something like, "Ah, yes, the moon's lettuce." You try not to laugh. There's something oddly touching about this, the earnestness, the idea that a leafy green could shepherd someone from fretfulness into peace. You've seen stranger things passed off as medicine, after all. And here, in the candlelit quiet, it almost feels right. Historians still argue whether these vegetable-based sleep tonics worked through chemistry or ceremony. Some say it was merely the placebo effect. Others believe in the subtle sedative power of lacticarium, especially when paired with warmth and routine. But perhaps the truth lies in the belief itself, the shared conviction that sleep was possible, even if fragile. You descend again back into the kitchen. On a shelf, you notice a thick book labeled Household Secrets for the Temperate Wife. You leaf through it slowly, your fingers gliding over the yellowed pages. There are dozens of sleep aids, many plant-based. Poppy syrup, warm barley water, infusions made from passion flower or valerian, but lettuce is mentioned most. One page even calls it green opium. The nickname touches you. You imagine an apothecary in a waistcoat proudly handing over a lettuce bundle like it's contraband. Use sparingly, he might say. Dreams may follow. Elsewhere in the city, sleep seekers went further. They blended lettuce with vinegar. They roasted it. They distilled it. One particularly eccentric chemist claimed to bottle the dreaming principle of lettuce in crystal bowls only, to be arrested later for selling plain milk tinted green. You laugh quietly. Even back then, there were sleep scammers. Not in a more rural house. An old woman sits by the hearth, rocking gently as she trims leaves into ribbons. She hums a low tune, something repetitive, hypnotic. Her cat blinks slowly beside her. She places the cut leaves into a cloth sachet and ties it shut, tucking it beneath her pillow. "Lettuce streams," she murmurs. This is another layer of Victorian belief. Not just the ingestion of remedies, but the nearness of them. That's simply being close to a calming herb could affect your rest. Lavender under the pillow, chamomile sewn into the collar, lettuce nestled in linen, scent and symbolism all woven into one. You glance upward. The ceiling is crisscrossed with drying herbs. A slow breeze stirs them, and the air smells like earth and memory. You step outside now, into a moonlit garden. Lettuce rows shimmer in the silver light, their leaves glossy with dew. You hear a low rustling, not wind, but a gentle harvesting. A boy in woolen pajamas is carefully picking lettuce under his grandmother's watchful eye. She wears a shawl, a bonnet, and the unshakable patience of someone who believes sleep can be cultivated. Literally, they place the leaves into a basket. He yawns. She doesn't say much, just hums the same tune the woman in the rocking chair was humming. A lullaby made of repetition and root vegetables. You're beginning to realize something. This isn't just a tale about strange food. It's about intention. The softness of trying, the ritual of care, the way people poured gentleness into the cracks where sleep had fled. In one final room, you witness a tableau. A child curled up in bed, cheeks pink from warmth, breath slow. Beside them, a dish of untouched lettuce soup. Perhaps they fell asleep before the first spoonful, or perhaps it was the idea of the soup that did the trick. You smile in a world obsessed with stimulus. There's something deeply soothing about the thought of falling asleep over a bowl of warm salad. The fire crackles low as the story turns inward again, away from kitchens and gardens and back into the dim, velvet-draped parlors of sleepless minds. You're entering the more metaphysical side of Victorian insomnia, the moment when remedies became rituals and rituals became superstition. All dressed up in the stiff collars of upper-class respectability, you find yourself in a drawing room where silence hangs like lace. A man in his 50s sits stiffly in a carved wooden chair, elbows perched on its arms, eyes wide open, despite the hour. His wife has long since gone to bed. So have the servants, but he remains. Not because he wants to, because he can't stop his mind from racing. This section isn't about food, it's about stillness, or the desperate attempt to manufacture it. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian England saw a boom in what were then called somnambulant technologies, tools designed to simulate, from mechanical ticking sleep regulators to weighted blankets filled with cherry stones. There was a market for stillness, even if one had to buy it in bulk. Fringe detail. Some inventors went so far as to create thought cages. Yes, that was the actual term-tight bonnet-like headgear that supposedly restricted brain activity by limiting skull temperature fluctuations. They were rarely effective, but they sold decently to gentlemen afraid of nighttime overthinking. Your current gentleman, he's chosen a less invasive tool. Before him is a brass metronome one, designed not for music but for monotony. He winds it up. The arm begins to swing. Tick, tick, tick. A soothing beat like a grandfather clock trying to whisper you to sleep. Historians still argue whether these devices had real neurological effect, or whether they worked purely through placebo, but studies of the era show that people recorded fewer nightmares and more dreamless states when metronomes or clockwork devices were left ticking beside their beds. Whether it was science or suggestion, the Victorian mind trusted rhythm. You inch closer. On the table beside him lies a little book, cloth bound, frayed at the corners, entitled Nocturnes for the Nervous Soul. You'll peek over his shoulder. Page contains a short sentence. Repetitive, vague, almost chant-like. You are the stillness. You are the breath. The hour will pass. You will remain. These were known as sleep litanies. They were all the rage in 1870s London salons, particularly among women who could afford neither silence nor servants. Memorized and repeated aloud, they served as a form of self-hypnosis, a kind of bedtime mantra with a Victorian accent. You glance around. On the mantel, beside a vase of dried violets, rests a small jar filled with wax pebbles. Not real pebbles, but molded blobs infused with sense-myrrh, sandalwood, orange peel. The idea was that you'd place them on your tongue and suck slowly as you lay in bed. The taste would lull you, or, at the very least, distract your brain from worrying about cold bills or rheumatism or existential despair. It didn't always work. You shift now into a boarding house, dimly lit, where 5 young men share a single, cramped bedroom. The beds creak, the walls are thin, and insomnia here is not poetic, it's pestilent. One man stares at the ceiling, another tosses under his thin wool blanket, a third mumbles a sleep litany, over and over, like a prayer chipped down to its barest vowels. You are the stillness, you are the breath. They've strung laundry above their beds to act as curtains. They've stuffed rags under the door to block out noise. One of them even holds a rock in each Honda crude method for falling asleep without flinching. If you dropped the rocks, you knew you were drifting. That moment, they believed, was key. In a quieter part of town, a widow in a wimple sits in her bed, brushing her hair in exact strokes, 50 each side. This, too, is part of her nightly ritual. She believes each stroke clears a thought. The last 5 are for dreams. You float above the city now, the rooftops silent, 1,000 lamps extinguished. London sleeps in fragments. No one sleeps. Well, not really. But some people believe they can outwit their minds, and that belief is powerful. Back on the ground, you find yourself in a tiny apothecary shop. A sign on the window reads "Cures for the Restless Soul." Inside, shelves overflow with tiny vials labeled "Silence," "Nightshade Whispers," "Gentle Hours." You doubt any of them contain anything more than alcohol and herbs, but that's not the point. The point is hope in a bottle. The shopkeeper is elderly, bespectacled, and only half trusting of his own wares. He mumbles to himself as he mixes something in a pewter bowl. Ground nutmeg, shaved soap, powdered sugar. He claims it smells like dreams. You're not sure what dreams smell like, but this smells like someone trying dot. As the hour deepens, you return to that gentleman in the first house. The metronome is still ticking. His eyes have closed now. Not fully asleep, but almost. There's a slackness to his jaw, a looseness to his fingers. You almost don't want to move, afraid you'll wake him by existing too loudly. And that, you realize, is the strange secret to these old-fashioned sleep tricks. They weren't efficient, they weren't fast, but they were gentle, and they gave people permission to stop trying so hard. You tiptoe out. Outside, the moon is high. Cats slip between fences. Chimneys sigh. And all across this city, stitched together by horse-drawn dreams, people whisper to themselves, "You are the stillness. You are the breath. The hour will pass. You will remain." The metronome ticks behind you as the streets begin to stir with something a little less rhythmic and a lot more desperate. You're drifting now through a colder part of the Victorian experience, less plush pillows and more thin blankets, less soothing repetition and more midnight pacing. It's the working class side of insomnia, where no one had the time to get poetic about their lack of sleep because dawn meant labor and sleeplessness was simply part of the job description. You find yourself in a shared lodging house near the docks. It smells like salt, sweat, and leftover stew. The walls are damp, the floors are loud, and in the corner, a young woman wraps herself tighter in her shawl, curled on a straw-stuffed mattress, eyes wide open. She's been awake for 3 nights straight. She's tried everything, pinching her own arms, reciting nursery rhymes, drinking that terrible bitter hop tea the landlord swore by. Nothing works. Mainstream historical fact. In Victorian England, sleep deprivation wasn't always viewed as a problem. It was often seen as proof of moral seriousness. If you were losing sleep, it meant you were working hard, thinking deeply, mourning properly, or praying fervently. Rest, in some circles, was considered suspiciously luxurious. The girl shifts. Her neighbor Ann, old washerwoman, leans over and mumbles, "Try onions on the feet." You blink. Yes, you heard that right. In the absence of medical knowledge and access to physicians, folk remedies thrive, especially those passed down from grannies and midwives. Sliced raw onions, wrapped in cheesecloth and tied around the feet, were believed to draw out the restless spirits or cool the blood. Whether they worked or just made everyone cry is still up for debate. Historians still argue whether the Victorians reliance on these remedies delayed more scientific sleep research, or whether these traditions preserved knowledge modern medicine eventually validated in other ways. Either way, sliced vegetables were getting a real workout. You duck now into a tenement in the heart of Manchester. A family of 6 sleeps in a single room. Or, rather, they try to. The baby cries, the eldest son coughs. The mother stares at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each creak of the roof. Her husband turns over again, then groans. To quiet their minds, many turn to repetition, not litanies this time, but numbers, counting backward from 1,000, or tracing their finger along imaginary squares on the mattress seam. Some whispered the names of every street in their neighborhood, then every neighbor, then every item they owned. Memory as lullaby. Nearby, a man barefoot and bitter paces the alley. He's just come off a shift at the foundry, and his limbs ache. He's exhausted, but sleep doesn't come. His hands twitch. His thoughts race. He lights a pipe, not to relax, but to give his mouth something to do. Inside his coat is a slip of paper. He unfolds it carefully. It's not a letter, it's a newspaper clipping advertising Dr. Fenwick's marvelous nocturnal tranquilizer. A syrup of opium, alcohol, and mint. The man can't afford it, but he imagines it. What it might feel like to forget the noise, the pain, the cold. You move further down the lane into a poorly lit room behind a bakery. A teenage apprentice lies awake on a flour sack. His remedy of choice. Listening to the ovens cooling, to the mice in the walls, to the dripping faucet in the scullery. He tries to imagine the drips are raindrops on a tin roof. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it makes him need the chamber pot. Here, the tools of sleep are humble. A cloth dipped in lavender water, a warm brick at the foot of the bed, socks stitched with rosemary in the seams. No one has a metronome. No one has wax pebbles that smell like myrrh. But the principle remains. Soothe the senses. Hope for the best. At a local parish house, you find something different. A small group women mostly gather in the evening, not for prayer, but for something quietly radical, shared rest. They sit on pillows in near silence. One woman reads softly from a devotional text. Another offers each attendee a drop of camphor oil on the wrist. It's not a medical solution. It's community comfort. The body might not sleep, but the heart feels less alone. You pass now into the countryside. In a stone cottage far from city smoke, an elderly couple lies side by side in a sagging bed. The fire is down to embers. She hums a tune passed from her own grandmother, a lullaby with no real words, just sound and memory. He listens. His breath slows. They've seen their share of sleepless nights. Bado, habisto, lost sheep, cholera. But here, in the quiet of old bones and old songs, something like peace slips in. You watch their chests rise and fall in rhythm, and you wonder, maybe that's the point. Maybe sleep, in its truest form, isn't just about tiredness or melatonin or ambient noise. Maybe it's about being heard, held, humored. Maybe the girl with onions on her feet and the man dreaming of mint opium both want the same thing: to feel safe enough to let go. You linger a moment longer before floating on. The world outside is full of creaking carts and chimney smoke and cats yowling into the night. But here and there between the panic and the pacing are moments of stillness, unpolished, uneven, unpoetic stillness, but stillness nonetheless. The hour turns softer now, drifting into the folds of night where reality and ritual begin to blur. You follow a flicker of lamplight down a tiled corridor, wide, echoing, and antiseptic. The floor smells faintly of carbolic soap. This isn't a home or a parlor. It's an institution, a Victorian sleep clinic, or the closest thing they had to one. You're inside the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, known to many by its less flattering name. Bedlam dot knots. All who struggled to sleep were seen as harmless eccentrics brewing lettuce soup or mumbling litanies. For some, chronic insomnia led to far darker Victorians didn't yet use terms like sleep disorder or mental health crisis. They called it nabasa exhaustion, night delirium, or lunacy induced by overwork. And here, in the echoing halls of places like Bedlam, such symptoms were handled with chilling precision. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, several institutions across Britain began experimenting with sensory deprivation and sensory alignment as cures for hysteria and sleeplessness. These included padded chambers with flickering gas lamps, mimicking candlelight, sound-dampened walls, and herbal poultices strapped to the chest like dream anchors. You find a young woman lying on a stiff cot, arms at her sides, eyes open but unfocused. A nurse in a linen cap dabs her wrists with rose water, not for comfort but for control. They believed certain smells could tether the mind to waking reality. Lavender, yes, but also vinegar and wormwood. The doctor nearby wears spectacles and a cravat so tight it looks like it's throttling him into importance. He flips through a worn leather notebook. Patient refuses to rest. Exhibits signs of nocturnal anxiety. Recommending camphor steam followed by soothing sermon from Nurse Edith. Yes, sermons, fringe detail. In some clinics, the treatment of insomnia included late-night religious recitations, not for the patient's soul, but because the soft drone of biblical passages, particularly from Leviticus, was considered an excellent sedative. Let no man join linen and wool in the same garment. You can see how even the mind's most frantic parts might eventually surrender. Historians still argue whether such spiritual interventions were designed more for moral control than actual healing. But the records show that some patients, particularly those from deeply religious households, in fact, find comfort in familiar scripture echoing softly through the ward. You watch now as Nurse Edith enters. She carries a small cloth bag. Inside, a pinch of hops, dried marjoram, and valerian root. She tucks it beneath the patient's pillow and begins to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl does not sleep, but her fingers stop twitching. Her breathing slows, dots outside the clinic. The rain begins to fall. London in mist is another creature entirely soggy, shivering, and full of ghosts. You drift past shuttered shop, raindrops pattering against iron gutters. In an alley beside a butch's, a man huddles in a doorway. His coat is too thin. His eyes are sunken. He hasn't slept in days, not because of madness, but because there's no safe place to close his eyes. His remedy is different. Gin. He swigs from a brown bottle, wipes his mouth, and hums a lullaby. His mother used to sing something about geese. He forgets most of the words, but it's the sound that matters. And now, just a few streets away, you stumble upon a different approach entirely. A drawing room turned makeshift laboratory. A woman in scholarly robes paces behind a desk covered in charts and candle stubs. Her name is Dr. Alden Grace, and she is rara female physician, not only but consulted for her expertise in nervous conditions. Her focus, dream management. She believes insomnia isn't caused by the absence of sleep, but by fear of what sleep might bring. Nightmares, subconscious guilt, the inescapable truth of one's own loneliness. So she's developed what she calls transitional dream scripts, soft monologues delivered aloud by a trusted voice, designed to prime the mind for only pleasant dreamscapes. You glance at her notebook. The first script reads, "You walk along a path made of cloud. No one follows. No one waits. Only wind and the memory of applause. Patients report less anxiety, fewer waking jolts." But Dr. Grace admits her method only works when the speaker is trusted. And many of her patients, they don't trust anyone. She turns to a gramophone beside her. A test record plays. Her own voice, slowed by waxen gears, whispering the script again. It crackles. It's eerie. But it's oddly calming. fringe detail, a few clinics experimented with phonographic lullabies decades before recorded sleep. Meditations became common. Some were musical, others were spoken. A few, rather famously, featured recordings of cats purring, sheep bleating, or even roosters crowing backwards, believed to reset the body's internal rhythms. Most of them flopped, but the intent, it was oddly familiar. Back on the street, the rain lightens to mists. You pass a coal merchant fast asleep against his cart. Somehow, despite the cold, despite the noise, he sleeps. The rhythm of the rain, the exhaustion of the day, or simply the fact that no one is watching, you'll never know. You head toward a grand home now. Not a palace, but close. A young noblewoman lies in her four-poster bed, wrapped in velvet sheets. She has all the money in the world, all the comforts, but sleep, it still evades her. Her maid kneels beside her, brushing her hair with slow, practiced strokes. 30 on the left, 30 on the right. The noblewoman whispers, "Do you think the mind ever sleeps before the heart is ready?" The maid doesn't answer. She just keeps brushing. And maybe that's all we can do. Really, brush, repeat, breathe, one gesture at a time. You pause. Outside the window, watching them both in that soft, wordless ritual. No tonics, no machines, just one hand moving through hair, through memory, through time. The hours drift deeper into the hush of night now, where even the street lamps feel like ghosts and time itself begins to slow its footsteps. You find yourself inside a narrow stone cottage, perched somewhere along the Yorkshire moors, far from the buzzing capitals and their grand sleep laboratories. Here, insomnia takes on a more intimate, homemade form, and so do the cures. The old woman inside sits beside a hearth, her body wrapped in 3 layers of wool and memory. Her name is Mrs. Grange, and she hasn't slept more than 3 hours in a row since her husband passed during the potato blight. But she's developed a method, not science, not prayer, just soup talk tonight. It's lettuce again chopped and stewed with marjoram, onion skin, and a dash of milk. She stirs the mixture with a long-handled spoon and hums softly, the tune drifting somewhere between a lullaby and a sea shanty. The clock ticks. The fire pops. Sleep does not arrive, but comfort does. Mainstream historical fact. Many Victorians believed that warm liquids, especially those involving leafy greens or soothing herbs, could lower mental temperatures and calm what physicians called the excitable brain. Lettuce, with its mild sedative properties, was considered especially helpful boiled into gruel or infused as a tea. No fancy technique, just hot water, time, and hope. Fringe detail, some rural households in the north of England made pillow sachets, small linen pouches filled with warm lettuce, boiled and wrapped while still steaming. These were tucked beneath pillows or held in laps. They smelled faintly of broth and laundry, and while they rarely worked for long, they at least gave the impression of trying. And sometimes that was enough. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies actually helped, or if the relief came simply from the ritual itself. But either way, many Victorians preferred a home remedy to a hospital one. There's a dignity to stirring your own soup, even when you know it won't cure you. Back in Mrs. Grange's home, you notice the wallpaper is peeling in one corner. There's a rosary nailed to the window frame. The wind outside howls like a dog in mourning, but the woman does not flinch. She drinks her soup slowly, as if each sip were a promise. She speaks aloud, perhaps to herself, perhaps to the spirits. "I once dreamed I was made of bread," she says, "and everyone wanted a piece." Then she chuckles. You almost smile. Now, let's float across the countryside to a different kind of Victorian sleeper, or rather, a non-sleeper. An inventor named Rupert Langley who frustrated with his own chronic insomnia, decided to engineer a solution in brass and gearwork.u. Step into his study. The walls are cluttered with sketches of complicated machines rotating pendulums, scent dispensers, phonograph cylinders wrapped in poems. At the center, a wooden chair with leather straps, a metal halo hovering inches above the headrest. This, Langley claimed, was the somnoscope, a contraption designed to align the brain's nocturnal magnetics. He never explained how, but he did insist that it only worked if you sang while using it, preferably songs about soup.you laugh. It's absurd, but there's something charming about it too. Mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw a boom in scientific sleep aids, from crank-powered lullaby machines to gas-assisted calming helmets filled with lavender steam. While most never caught on, they were popular in medical exhibitions and wealthy eccentric households where sleep was considered not just a necessity but a hobby. Fringe detail. Langley's device was said to emit a faint worry sound, like a distant fanfare. He claimed this white noise of innovation helped override intrusive thoughts. Unfortunately, most who tried it reported headaches or mild electrocution. Still, a few swore by it. One nobleman allegedly used it every evening before supper and slept like an anvil. Historians still argue whether Langley was a fraud or simply ahead of his time, but his journals survive, filled with odd equations and sketch diagrams of sleeping cats labeled ideal form. And really, that's the sort of legacy we can all aspire to. As you leave the study, you hear a phonograph playing something distant, distorted. You follow it into the night air. Another room, another dream. Now you're in a modest townhouse in Bristow. A widower lies awake in bed, one arm folded under his head. His wife used to read to him before sleep encyclopedias, mostly or travelogues with long place names. Since she passed, he's continued the ritual himself, whispering passages aloud into the quiet. Wadi Halfa, he says, a desert town known for its scorching winds and migratory birds. He pauses. His voice cracks. Then he tries again. You sit with him as he reads on. Not because the facts are fascinating, but because they fill the space. Because even dry knowledge can be a lullaby if you speak it gently enough. Fringe detail. Some Victorians kept what they called sleep books, collections so especially. Dull or repetitive texts read each night as a cognitive sedative. These might include train schedules, botanical indexes, or legal codes. One popular volume, the Parliamentary Rail Act Digest, was nicknamed the Yawn. You can almost hear the widower chuckle as he turns the page. Clause 37, no sheep may be transported by rail on Wednesdays. He closes his eyes. The book slips from his fingers. Maybe it's working after all. The house creaks, wind tapping against the window pane like an old friend, and you realize something, whether by soup, machine, book, or ritual. What all these people saw wasn't sleep alone. It was permission to rest, to stop, to let go for a little while without fear. And now maybe you're ready to. The next chapter of our sleepless journey takes you somewhere altogether stranger, somewhere where science, superstition, and sheer desperation swirled together like mist over the Thames. Welcome to the Victorian Asylum. Don't worry, it's not as grim as you'd expect. At least, not all the time. You're standing just inside the cool stone hall of St. Balthazar's Sleep Clinic, an annex of a larger mental hospital tucked away in the Surrey countryside. Here, tucked between wards for melancholia and neurasthenia, was a wing entirely devoted to the chronically no rest for the weary. Someone must have joked him, then decided to treat it seriously. The halls are quiet, the smell of carbolic and chamomile clinging to the air. At the far end, a physician in a high-buttoned vest reviews a clipboard. He's wearing pince-nez and muttering to himself. Patient 34 refuses to sleep until the ceiling is brushed. You glance up. It is indeed brushed nightly with a stiff broom. Victorians always thorough. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, insomnia had entered medical literature as a distinct condition, no longer just a symptom of nerves or grief. Clinics were established across Britain, many adopting novel techniques to induce natural rest without opiates. Sleep deprivation was considered a threat to moral reasoning and even to public order. Fringe detail. Some asylums conducted bed immersion therapy, where patients were swaddled in warm, wet flannel and placed under weighted horsehair blankets. The goal wasn't comfort so much as one report from 1868 claimed a woman slept 3 days straight after a single session. She later claimed she dreamed of bread crusts and marionettes. Historians still argue whether these clinics were havens or prisons. Many were both, but some doctors, particularly the younger ones, genuinely wanted to help, experimenting with everything from colored glass filters to lullaby duets played on glass harmonicas. One physician, Dr. Farley, kept a personal record of dream triggers. In his journal, he theorized that certain smells-candled wax, rain-soaked wool, ink could lull the mind into drowsiness. He created something called the soper box, a wooden cube with compartments for these scents. Nurses would open it under a patient's nose at bedtime. Was it effective? Let's just say one nurse began using it on herself. You walk past rows of small beds, each with hand-stitched quilts and little ivory nameplates. The patients stir. One hums a hymn about sparrows. Another mutters numbers. But here and there, someone's sleep smells slack, brow smooth. They look ... peaceful ... Now, let's step out into the moonlight and drift down a cobbled lane where sleep was not prescribed but performed. We're in the study of one Mr. Leland Darby, amateur philosopher and very serious man of ritual. Leland believed sleep was a kind of ceremony and, as such, must follow strict choreography. He would light 4 beeswax candles, chant a poem to the goddess Hypno, brush his teeth with lemon water, and lie on the floorboards with a brick under his knees. The brick was crucial. Without it, he claimed, his dreams grew violent. You raised an eyebrow. He would have liked that. Eyebrows were, to him, symbols of skepticism and therefore mental stimulation. He shaved his off at one point, just in case. Mainstream historical fact. Many Victorians dabbled in esoteric or spiritual practices to help induce rest, especially among the educated and wealthy. Rituals involving the moon's position, mineral placement, or even coded mantras were seen not as delusions but disciplined sleep hygiene. Fringe detail. Leland's brick actually made it into a letter he sent to Charles Dickens, proposing a chapter in household words titled Bricks for the Brain. Dickens never responded, but the brick remains in the Darby family to this day. They keep it in a glass case labeled Sleepmaker. Historians still argue whether such rituals were prototherapy or simply eccentricity at scale. But Leland himself was convinced that mean and imaginary was a better sedative than morphine. And hey, he did sleep 6 hours a night with the brick. Now we meander further past the rituals and institutions into something quieter. Child's bedroom, gas lamp flickering softly, lace curtains dancing with the breeze. Here, sleep was coaxed, not with science or soup, but with sound. A father sits beside a bed, reading aloud from a worn volume of Aesop. His voice is even unheard. The child freckled fidgety glitches, a stuffed goose made of rice sacks and cotton thread. When the father finishes, he doesn't say goodnight. He simply hums. It's a low, gentle tune, wordless, repetitive, the kind that drifts straight past your ears and burrows into your bones. The boy yawns, his hands loosen, sleep claims him, merciful and soft. Mainstream historical fact. Lullabies were not just for children, they were a form of oral medicine passed down through generations. Victorian families often had their own sleep songs, some dating back centuries. Many included themes of protection, food, and the weather. Sleep, my maroon, the clouds are fat, the kettle sings, the world stays flat. Fringe detail. Some of these lullabies included references to contemporary anxiety-strained schedules. Tax collectors, overdue, milk deliveries, hidden in metaphor. One popular lullaby in London mentioned a stony horse that gallops at dusk, which scholars later linked to a specific debt collector's wagon. Historians still argue whether lullabies evolved primarily for the child's benefit or the parents. But either way, they worked. Or at least, they passed the time. And sometimes, that's enough. Back in the boy's room, the father stands. He presses a kiss to the child's forehead. Then, strangely, he lies down on the floor beside the bed. Perhaps he doesn't trust his own dreams. Or perhaps, like many before him, he finds comfort in the proximity of sleep heaven if it's someone else's. The gaslight flickers once more. Outside, a fox pads past the window, and the night grows deeper. You wake to the sound of a spoon stirring gently in a teacup. No, thinking just a soft ceramic whirl over and over. We're in a tiny attic room now, crammed with books, potions, folded shawls, and a single cat curled on a windowsill. The woman. At the table, Miss Cordelia Vine is making her infamous sleep draft. The air smells of fennel, dried pear, and what might be rose water. Or soap. Cordelia is not a doctor. She never claimed to be. What she is, at least, according to her satisfied clientelist, the last honest somnambulist in Kent. Her motto, no dreams unless requested. And yes, she embroidered it on a pillow. Mainstream historical fact. In the 1800s, especially in rural areas, women known as cunning folk or wise women served as unofficial healers. Though some dabbled in midwifery or herbalism, others focused entirely on sleep-curing nightmares, banishing night sweats, and crafting tonics designed to pull the mind gently toward rest without risk of addiction. Fringe detail. Cordelia's draft contained a rare addition, steeped lettuce root. Not the leaf, not the stem, the root. She believed it held dreams from the soil. Some claim it gave you vivid visions of rivers and fog. Others say it just made you burp. Historians still argue whether such witches were shunned or cherished. The truth is, it depended on the town. In some villages, these women were brought jars of cream and eggs as thanks. In others, they were whispered about and avoided. Cordelia, though, she kept sleeping logs. She even offered money-back guarantees. You remembered the dream well enough to describe it tonight. Her customer is a tall man with circles under his eyes and fingers, stained with newsprint ink. He's an editor from London, sleepless from deadlines and scandal. Cordelia nods as he talks. She says little, pours a finger of the draft, and gestures to the cot. Lie down. No talking after sip. He obeys. The cat lifts one lazy eye, unimpressed. Cordelia watches as he swallows. Then she hums. It's not a song. Not really. Just notes. Unstructured. She says sound helps settle the breath. Her own breath is slow, practiced. You find yourself copying it in, out, slower, softer. The man's eyes flutter. His lips part. And then silence. You can almost smell the sleep in the room, now a musky, warm fog curling behind your eyelids. But Cordelia isn't finished. She pulls a small slip of paper from her sleeve and tucks it under the man's pillow. A dream request. Gentle boat ride. No passengers. Bright stars. She's precise like that dot. As we leave Cordelia to her nocturnal work, we drift to another forgotten nook of the 19th century. The traveling sleep demonstrator. Yes, really, picture this. A velvet stage in the back room of a tavern. Rows of curious Londoners clutching pints, whispering eagerly. On stage, A tall man in a blue frock coat bows dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the slumbering sphinx." Enter a young boy, barely 12, barefoot and blinking. The man places 2 fingers to the child's forehead, whispers something in Greek, and slowly, theatrically, the boy collapses into a cot. Mainstream historical fact. Hypnotism was booming during the Victorian period, often referred to as mesmerism. It captivated crowds and even appeared in early medical circles. Doctors, charlatans, and stage performers all dabbled in the sleep arts, promising everything from restful nights to spiritual contact, fringe detail. Some performers developed sleep personas, characters they'd become while in a trance. One woman became a clairvoyant cook, giving recipes from beyond the veil. Another, a child of 6, reportedly spoke fluent Latin under trance. She did not, it should be noted, know Latin while awake. Historians still argue whether Victorian hypnotism was a legitimate form of therapy or just Victorian theater at its most melodramatic, but what's clear is that sleep was entertainment. It was spectacle, and somewhere beneath the showmanship, people genuinely hoped it might help them rest. The slumbering sphinx now snores softly on stage. The crowd holds its breath. A woman in the front row wipes her eyes. "He looks so peaceful," she whispers. Then the man mesmerisferin, if the poster is to be believed, lifts a small tuning fork, strikes it, and places it beside the boy's ear. His eyes twitch. He stirs. He yawns. He wakes. The crowd erupts. Some clapped for the drama. Others, quietly, wished they could be. Next, we leave the tavern and drift toward a darker corner of the story, though. Not too dark. Just ... shadowy. Here's a man alone in his room, staring at a ticking clock. The second hand moves too quickly or too slowly. He can't tell anymore. His name is Mr. Llewellyn Quist, and he suffers from what we now call sleep anxiety. Llewellyn tried everything: soporific teas, cold baths, counting sheep, even Cordelia's draft. Nothing worked. And so he made charts of moon cycles, of temperature fluctuations, of dream types categorized by breakfast. His most prized invention, the slumber gauge, a device of springs and levers meant to measure sleepiness. It never worked, but he believed in it. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian thinkers were deeply invested in self-measurement. The period saw an explosion of personal logs of health, dreams, emotions. Sleep was no exception. Diaries filled with times I awoke and number of blinks before REM filled dusty drawers. Fringe detail. Llewellyn claimed that on nights of the waning crescent, sleep was impossible unless he ate 2 spoonfuls of plum jam at 10:47 precisely. He left a note to this effect. His niece found it years later, framed it, and gave it to her therapist. Historians still argue whether these obsessive rituals were pathologies or early versions of modern CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But either way, Llewellyn's story ends softly. He eventually gave up the clock, the jam, the charts. Instead, he bought a small dog named Mary, and for some reason, her snoring helped. You hear it now, tinny, rhythmic, contented. And suddenly, Llewellyn is asleep. As are we, almost. Now, let's wander through a different sort of room, larger, richer, tinged with incense and the quiet weight of money. We're in the parlor of Lady Selina Rathbone, heiress to a starch fortune and, more relevantly, the unofficial patron of London's most fashionable sleep salons. You blink, and the world has changed. Everything here is velvet and rosewood. Candelabras flicker, carpets muffle your steps, and someone's always offering you lemon water. Lady Selina believed that insomnia wasn't a problem, it was a matter of aesthetic imbalance. Her solution, ambience. Mainstream historical fact. By the late Victorian era, sleep had become a high society concern as industrial schedules tightened and social obligations multiplied. Sleeplessness crept into even the grandest drawing rooms. In response, the wealthy sought increasingly elaborate remedies, customized beds, perfumed linens, and entire rooms designed solely for rest. Fringe detail. Selina commissioned the harpist to play only in the key of E-flat minor during her evening tea, soothing to the pineal gland. She insists her tea, by the way, was chamomile steeped in moonlight, or at least that's what the label claimed. Historians still argue whether these salons were genuinely therapeutic or just a new way to flaunt wealth, but what's undeniable is that they helped people feel attended to. And in a world where insomnia often came with shame, that feeling mattered. You spot her now, reclining beneath a canopy of hand-painted moths, eyes half shut as a butlet, lavender oil across the tiled floor. It's not about the oil. It's about ritual, repetition. The gentle suggestion that something is being done. That night, a dozen guests lie in plush robes, breathing in unison as a soft-voiced reader reads the Song of Hype. Selina never makes it past the pot with the pine trees. Not once that we tiptoe away and drift toward another room. This one cold, spare, and much more practical. A hospital ward. This is the Royal Sleep Observation Chamber, circa 80-83, 4 beds, 1 nurse, and behind a two-way mirror, a team of scholars, scribbling furiously. We've moved from tea and oil to clipboards and candle clocks. Tonight's patient is Mr. Aldous Finch, age 42, who claims he has not slept in 6 nights. His voice trembles. His eyes twitch. His fingers tap an invisible piano. Doctors want to observe natural sleep induction. Aldous, however, just wants to be unconscious. Mainstream historical fact. The Victorian period saw the birth of formal sleep science. Institutions began to treat insomnia as a medical, not moral issue. Sleep was timed, measured, and documented. Patients were monitored through the night, their positions recorded, their breath rates noted. Fringe detail. One physician doctor believed that placing a copper coin beneath the tongue increased sleep reliability. The metal grounds the mind, he claimed. The chamber had a whole drawer full of pre-sanitized coins. Historians still argue whether early sleep medicine truly helped patients or just cataloged their suffering. The truth is somewhere in the yawn between. Tonight, Aldous finally dozes off at 4:27 a.m. Moments after the nurse reads from Little Dorrit and accidentally drops her clipboard. The sound startles him, then oddly relaxes him. Kimatazu. Bless the clatter and exhales. Sleep begins. We float now to the countryside. You're walking through dew-covered grass. The sun hasn't risen. You follow a line of lanterns hung from birch poles, and ahead, in a clearing, is something unexpected. A field sleep circle. This, believe it or not, was a real thing. In parts of Yorkshire and Devonshire, rural communities hosted open-air sleep gatherings. Neighbors would gather just before dawn, lie in circles on woven mats, and commune with sleep. Think of it as competitive napping meets folk festival. Mainstream historical fact. Victorians loved outdoor health practices, cold water immersion, open-air schools, sunbathing for tuberculosis. Sleep circles fit the pattern. Nature was clean, pure, and healing, and sleep, done communally, was considered bonding. Fringe detail. Some sleep circles included a dream bell, a small chime rung softly every 10 minutes. If you stirred, you were said to be out of tune with the dream chorus. No judgment, just mild amusement. Historians still argue whether these circles were effective or just eccentric, but the participants swore by them. And once a year, Local children would crown a sleep monarch, the person who snored most gently for the longest. Tonight's monarch is Miss Nellie Witt, age 9, whose tiny snores are said to sound like a kitten sighing. You lie back on a mat. The grass tickles your neck. A sheep bleats faintly in the distance. Someone's uncle mutters, "Not again," and turns over. You close your eyes. It's peaceful here. And now on to a final strange place. Somewhere between real and imagined. A room that's not a room. A lullaby of ideas. Where all the lettuce, soup, moonlight tea, and velvet-draped dreams swirl into one soft truth. It's the Pepper Room. Yes, we're finally here. A hidden ritual among certain Graias, monks, and bathhouse attendants claimed that true sleep only came after embracing discomfort. Hence the Pepper song. You walk through a narrow corridor. Smells of salt. Sharp, biting, familiar. There's a bowl of peppers in the center. A voice says, "Eat, then sing." No tune, just tone. Mainstream historical fact. Sensory sleep rituals existed in many cultures. Spicy food to burn away thoughts, freezing baths to numb worry, perfumed fire to smoke out the past. Fringe detail. In this room, you don't actually eat the pepper. You just hold it. Let it stain your fingers. The scent stays on you. You sing not loudly, but from your chest stand, the idea is that you've tasted truth, even if only through suggestion. Historians still argue whether the pepper song was real or just a metaphor passed around tired philosophers. But you hum it now, and whether you believe in it or not, your breath slows, and slows, and slows. We begin again in motion, this time by train. The year is 1887, and you're seated in a second-class compartment rattling through the English countryside. Across from you sits a man with a deep furrow in his brow, one gloved hand resting on a carpet bag, the other gripping a lace-trimmed handkerchief. He doesn't notice you. He's reading a pamphlet titled Rest in Motion, Railway Sleep and the New Mind. That's your first clue that this isn't just a journey, it's an experiment. Mainstream historical fact. As railways expanded in the Victorian age, overnight trains grew more common. Sleeping cars were introduced to accommodate long-distance travelers. But these weren't today's padded cocoons. They were wood-paneled bunks with shared blankets and gaslit corridor clattering at full tilt through the night. Fringe detail. A short-lived London group calling themselves the Railway Rest Society believed that movement lulled the brain into a semi-hypnotic state, ideal for unlocking dream wisdom. They held monthly excursions, during which members attempted to nap while reciting lines from Marcus Aurelius. Historians still argue whether sleep was therapeutic or simply inevitable due to fatigue. But some journals from the time describe locomotive dreaming, a sleep so deep and strange. It felt like moving through a tunnel of memory with the whistle as your lullaby. Tonight, the man across from you dozes off just before Brighton, his chin dips. His pamphlet slides to the floor. Outside the window, the moon rides low across freshly plowed fields, silvering every ridge, and within moments, you too feel your spine begin to melt into the rhythm of the rails. You reach a station, somewhere quiet, unmarked. You get off. And now we arrive gently at an artist's loft in Paris. 1891, morning sunlight pools on warped floorboards. There's a phonograph crackling softly. A man with coal dark hair and a mustard yellow cravat is sketching the shape of a dream he had while napping beside a pot of overcooked leeks. This is Anatole Lamé, a painter known for his Insomnia and his vegetables. Mainstream historical fact. Many artists of the late 19th century viewed sleep not as a necessity, but a material. They mapped their dreams, infused their work with unconscious symbolism, and sometimes delayed rest entirely in search of clarity. Van Gogh, for example, often painted through the night. Fringe detail. Lavender kept a notebook titled Things I Dream When Eating Onions. It contained poems, half-finished paintings, and a detailed breakdown of the spices he believed influenced specific themes. Cardamom brought memories, time, he claimed, conjured storms. Historians still argue whether these sleep food experiments were genuine insight or artistic, but it doesn't matter to you now, because you're watching him paint. His brush barely touches the canvas, just dabs of pale green, smudges of maroon, he mutters. This one's about my grandmother's porch, the way her soup boiled over. When I told my first lie, you don't know what the image is yet, but it makes your eyes sting. He yawns. He doesn't mean to. It just happens. The brush clatters to the floor, and he falls asleep right there in the chair, face tilted toward the light. You hear the soft clink of a spoon stirring in a forgotten teacup. We drift once more, this time to a small boarding school in Edinburgh. It's nearly midnight. The hallway smells of chalk, damp wool, and blackberry ink. Behind a heavy green curtain is the night room, a space designed by the headmaster himself to combat student restlessness. Inside, a row of cups, a massive globe, and a collection of wax cylinders labeled calming lessons. Every child here has trouble sleeping. Every child here has learned to fear the ticking of the dormitory clock. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian educators believed that sleep was tied to moral strength. Children who didn't sleep were considered undisciplined. Schools adopted strict bedtime regimens, including silent lying, where students had to remain motionless for a full hour, regardless of whether sleep came. Fringe detail. This school believed in narrative hypnosis. Every night, a lesson was played aloud. But the lesson was nonsense. How to boil water using only your imagination. Or why do stars avoid soup? The absurdity distracted the mind. Teachers claimed it freed it. Historians still argue whether this method was effective or borderline absurd. But that night, one boy seaman falls asleep just as the recording reaches. Now imagine the kettle is a cloud. It whistles only for you. We exit as the wax cylinder clicks into silence. Now. Let's settle in one last home, man. Ordinary one. Stone chimney. Kitchen fire. One bedroom upstairs. No velvet. No silver. Just a small oil lamp and a woman named Miss Idris Finch. Idris isn't a healer. She's not a performer or noble or doctor. She works at the hat factory, but what she's known for, at least by the 3 children she helps raises her bedtime stories every night, the same 3. The girl with the ice shoes, the owl who forgot to fly, and the boy who could sleep through thunder. Always the same order, always the same words. Mainstream historical facts. Bedtime storytelling, though less documented than other sleep rituals, played a crucial role in Victorian working-class homes. Repetition was comforting. Predictability meant safety. Fringe detail. Idris always lit a sprig of thyme in a shallow dish before starting. She said it was to chase the spiders from the dreams. The children never questioned it, neither did the dreams. Historians still argue whether oral bedtime traditions have shaped modern sleep culture more than medicine ever has. But tonight, you're curled on the floor beside the fire. You listen as Idris's voice grows softer with each word. And then he slept not because he was tired, but because the world was finally quiet. You yawn. So does she. Outside, rain taps gently against the window. Inside, nothing stirs. You're in the garden now, though it's night, and not everything is clear. Stone benches gleam with dew. Moonlight pools in patches between the hedges. Somewhere, wind chimes tickle the air, their tones barely more than a breath. This is a botanical sleep chamber, or, as the Victorians called it, this not quite indoors, not quite outdoors. This sleep therapy was part science experiment, part spiritual retreat, a greenhouse filled with aromatic plants, soft earth, and the sound of crickets imported from Surrey. Yes, even the crickets were curated. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian botanists and health enthusiasts believed certain plants gave off calming vapors, especially lavender, lemon balm, and hops. Greenhouses were occasionally repurposed as places of rest for those suffering from night nerves. Fringe detail. One physician insisted that fennel, when placed in one's shoes before entering the somnarium, ensured dreams of length and silk. Another claimed a patch of anise by the door absorbed negative energy. Whether it worked or not, the plants got watered and the guests got drowsy. Historians still argue whether these chambers helped sleep or simply provided a quiet place to escape marital expectations. But under that lattice of climbing jasmine, no one seemed to care. You pass a man, sleeping in a wheelbarrow, his snores timed perfectly to the sway of a hanging fern. A girl is curled beside a potted rosemary bush, a book still open on her chest. A cat tiptoes through chamomile, careful not to wake the herbs. And just when you think it's too quiet to last, an older woman begins to hum. Not a melody, not a song, just a steady, low vibration, as if echoing from the roots of the garden itself. One by one, others join in. No words, no tune, just presence. We move again, this time to a less idyllic setting. The apothecary. Not a cozy shop. No, this. One smells of vinegar, damp rope, and mothballs. The shelves groan with glass bottles. Many the floor squeaks like a rat in protest. You are here for something stronger. The apothecary is not a man of words. He raises one bushy eyebrow and gestures to a small blue vial. You read the label Somnoros. For the reluctant sleeper. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian apothecaries regularly sold sleep tonics composed of herbal extracts mixed with alcohol or opiates. Some were quinine, lavender oil, valerian, chamomile, but others included chloral, hydrate, laudanum, or bromides. Fringe detail. One infamous recipe for Dr. Wolf's night milk contained a blend of nutmeg, powdered pearl, and a tincture of batwing, almost certainly a marketing flourish, but customers swore it worked. Another claimed that stirring the bottle counterclockwise activated its sleep energy. Historians still argue whether these tonics brought true rest or simply knocked people unconscious. But the Victorians weren't too picky. Sleep was sleep. You lift the vial. It's heavier than expected. You unstopper it and sniff. There's the faintest whiff of cloves, lemon peel, and something metallic. Maybe memory. Maybe myth. The apothecary speaks just once. Don't dream too far. Then he turns away, already measuring powder into a scale for the next customer. You step outside. Now we come to the strangest location yet. The Dream Museum. Not a metaphor, not an allegory, a literal building run by eccentric siblings near Liverpool in the 1890s. This museum displayed nothing but dream descriptions drawn or dictated by sleepers and insomniacs alike. Every wall, every glass case, every display someone's night vision, cataloged and archived mainstream historical fact. Victorian fascination with dreams surged in the late 19th century. Well before Freud. Clubs were formed to analyze recurring imagery, and newspapers occasionally published readers' dreams alongside horoscopes. Fringe detail. This museum included a nap booth. Guests could take a supervised 20-minute nap, then record their dream into a phonograph. The recordings were transcribed and added to the library. A favorite entry: I married a violin and had 8 tiny cellos. Historians still argue whether this museum actually existed or was simply a long-running hoax by 2 amateur, but a few archived letters mention it, always in tones of gentle awe. You walk through its dim halls. One glass frame shows a sketch of a lion made of soot. Another, a field of floating spoons. A child's scrawl reads, The sky fell, but it was soft. There is no laughter here, just reverence and the soft shuffle of slippers on carpet. We float again. Final stop. Not a room, but a memory. Your memory. It's not Victorian, not historical, not even distant. It's the one time you fell asleep in a chair while rain hit the window just right, when the smell of toast reminded you of someone long gone, when you swore you'd only rest your eyes and woke up 4 hours later. Blanket pulled over you by a hand you never saw, because that, in the end, is what all this has been about. Not lettuce soup, not harp music, not moth murals. It's been about the strange, silly, desperate ways humans seek peace. The methods don't matter. Only the result. Only the pause. You're back in the bedroom now, not a specific one, just the soft notion of one, a space blurred by candlelight and shadow. Somewhere, a fire has gone to embers. Somewhere else, a clock ticks not out of urgency, but because it always has. Let's return to that lettuce soup, shall we? It started this journey, a humble bowl, simmered leaves, warm broth, sleep served with a spoon. You lie down in the imagined bed of a Victorian woman in 1872, her bonnet unpinned, slippers carefully lined beside her washstand. She's spooning soup slowly, eyes already heavy. You're not watching her, or near her, or dreaming of her. Mainstream historical fact. In Victorian homes, sleep wasn't just a health gullet, was an act of morality. Rest too little, and you risked irritability, which hinted at spiritual weakness. Rest too much, and you were branded lazy or melancholic. The ideal was a restful 8, achieved not by indulgence, but by virtue and routine. Fringe detail. Some etiquette guides from the period advised women to visualize the sea when struggling to sleep, believing waves lulled the mind like cradle rockings. Others warned against sleeping too close to books, claiming ink fumes disturbed the unconscious. Historians still argue whether Victorian insomnia was really as rampant as the diaries and doctor logs suggest, or if the upper classes simply had the time to complain about it. But in those long candlelit nights between supper and silence, it's not hard to believe the hours sometimes dragged like a reluctant carriage. You shift slightly, pulling the imagined quilt higher. Now think of everything you've seen. The lettuce soup, the harp room, the whisper baths, the honey lullabies, the dream museum filled with velvet scraps of subconscious. Each oddity, each cure had one thing in common: belief. Belief that rest could be earned, that peace was possible, that sleeplessness was a puzzle worth solving, even if the answer turned out to be nutmeg in warm milk. There's something wonderfully human in that, don't you think? The lengths we'll go to for a night's sleep. Now picture a final scene. You're standing at the edge of a village, the sky bruised with twilight. A line of people in night clothes is making its way to a small hill. At the top, a man is lighting a lantern, the old-fashioned kind with smoky glass and brass handles. Each person brings something different to flower. A feather pillow, a bundle of herbs. They sit in a circle. No words, no instructions, just presence, just breath. And then, softly, the man begins to read. It's nothing special. Just the entries from a sleep journal found in a dusty drawer. A woman's record of every night she managed to drift off, and how some were after crying, some after soup, one after hearing a fox bark in the garden. You don't hear the words, but you feel them. Now, listen. Your own breath is slower. Your limbs heavy. The fog is close now, and so we slip into the 300-word wind down, last stretch of this strange little story. The pages are closing now, the voices softening, the candle gutters, then steadies, then fades. Around you, the shapes of things begin to lose their names. That's how, sleep is coming out in a crash. But in the gentle blur, whatever was tugging at your thoughts before let it drift, like steam off a teacup, like an echo too far to follow. Your body remembers how to rest. It's older than your worries, older than your screens, older than clocks and work and checklists. It knows what to do, so give it that gift. Sink, let the last tendrils of this tale wrap around you, not to bind, but to blanket. The lettuce soup, the harp room, the whisper bath. They were never cures. Really. They were lullabies. Invented, improvised, passed down with hope. Let them be yours now. Let them hold you gently. Like warm hands smoothing a coverlet. You've made it to the end. There is no test, no recap, no moral, just rest. A breath in, a breath out, and the hush of sleep.